Finally, here it is, the Suzuki DR-Z4S, a bike that's been eagerly awaited and one we haven't seen in a long while, but there's already quite the buzz around it, and the big talking point is the price. It's said to cost nearly 10,000 euros. So is it really worth that kind of money, and how well has the comeback of the legendary DR-Z400 turned out? You'll find out in this video.
It had to happen.
A very, very light enduro, a hard enduro even, but still with a decent touch of long distance capability, so you can take in a bit of tarmac as well. Maybe even use it to bridge the trip to your off-road track, because let's be honest, especially in places like Germany, most trails aren't exactly right behind your garden fence. So I think it's an exciting model, and judging by the reactions to the announcement, it clearly struck a nerve. People have been having some pretty heated debates, both from a technical point of view and especially when it comes to the price. All the more reason I was pleased we got not just one but 2 days of riding in. Today I'm actually at the end of day 1 and we've already clocked up nearly 130 kilometers tomorrow. We're expecting to do another 60 plus and that'll be proper off-road. So I'll check in again later from a different spot. But for now, let's get into the technical details. What's new, what's changed? I'll tell you all about it here during our lunch break. Cheers from the midday stop on our first riding day. Time to talk about the technical updates on the DR-Z4S, because I've seen a few comments saying things like, yeah, they just made the engine Euro 5 Plus compliant, slapped on some new plastics and an LED headlight and called it a day. But it's not quite that simple. Let's break it down. Naturally, one of the big factors was meeting the Euro 5 Plus emission standard, and that came with a few challenges. That's why you can see this bulge here. It's a catalytic converter, but it's not the only one. They found that due to the heat generated and the space needed for the rider's leg and so on, it's actually better to use 2 smaller converters instead of 1 big one. The first one is right here, very obvious. The second is located at the start of the silencer on this US spec bike we're riding, which by the way has the same certification data and performance figures as the European version. The rear catalytic converter is basically inactive because it's designed to filter out certain unwanted exhaust gases, something that's just not feasible in the US. But the core issue remains. When you add resistance into the exhaust flow with catalytic converters, you lose engine power. And that's a no-go, especially in this class. So what did they do? They pretty much reworked everything inside. The outer shape has stayed more or less the same. You could say the packaging is familiar, but the internals have changed quite a lot. First off, a big focus was reducing friction. They've managed to cut it by 20% thanks to revised pistons and a few fine tweaks to the crankshaft. Then there's the push for efficiency. That's why the DR-Z now comes with 2 spark plugs firing simultaneously, which helps achieve cleaner combustion. That brings about 5% lower fuel consumption, making a range of well over 250 kilometers possible, even though the tank has been reduced from 10 liters to 8.7 liters. Another benefit of the twin spark plugs, let's not forget, is that the engine is a bit difficult to balance. Still, they had to go even further to get more power out of it. So they've also reworked the intake, which is nicely tucked away over here. It now features a wider intake flow, which gives you more torque in the lower ref range. And they've also upgraded the throttle body. It's now bigger. At 43 millimeters, that means you also get more power higher up in the refs. If you overlay the torque curves, you'll actually see that there's simply more torque across the ref range in this new DR-Z4S. What else is new? Well, if you know the old one, you'll notice straight away that the frame is different too. We now have a completely new steel frame, what's basically a semi-double cradle design. The oil tank is still built into the frame, just like before. And at the back, there's a nicely bolted on aluminium subframe as well as an aluminium swing arm. There are also some updates that are simply essential in 2025. For instance, there's now an assist and slipper clutch. And right here on display, though, they've stuck with the already slightly dated LCD screen. Personally, that doesn't bother me. It's still perfectly readable. What we do get now, which wasn't there before, is a fuel gauge and a gear indicator. That's honestly quite handy. The electronics are classic Suzuki, with a mode selector here, so you can switch between A, B and C modes depending on your preference. Plus there's traction control, a gravel mode, and 2 road traction control settings, one more restrictive, one less so. The ABS can be fully deactivated at the rear. Now let's talk about ergonomics, because there have been quite a few changes there too. The foot pegs have been moved 15 millimeters back, the handlebar is 2 millimeters higher, and the seat has been lowered by 15 millimeters. That gives us a seat height of 920 millimeters. The seat has also been widened by 17 millimeters, now measuring 115 millimeters across. Moving on to the suspension, as you'd expect, we've got a proper upside down front fork, generous suspension travel, 280 millimeters at the front and 298 millimeters at the rear via the ProLink system. The suspension is fully adjustable except for front preload. And since I'm looking at them, the brakes have been beefed up too, 270 millimeters at the front and 240 millimeters at the rear with radially mounted calipers. And just to give you a quick spoiler for the riding impressions, they're really, really good. But I'll get into that a bit later. Now to the opposite of braking, the throttle. We don't have ride-by-wire here, but the solution they've gone for is actually pretty clever, I think. What we've got is a traditional throttle cable, as you can see here, running from the throttle grip. If the camera focuses, yep, there it is. And it runs to just under the seat. That's where the sensor is located, which is cable operated and picks up the throttle position before sending the signal to the electronically controlled throttle valve. So in a way, you still get a very analog throttle feel. And I really like it so far. And finally, let's come to what's probably the last major sticking point, and one that I think a lot of people are rightly criticizing, the gearbox. Because we've still only got 5 gears. That's something many of you have mentioned in the comments. On top of that, the gear ratios are unchanged. The only thing that's different is the final drive, now a bit longer, with 15 teeth on the front sprocket and 43 at the rear. That's longer than before. I believe it used to be 14 and 41, if I'm not mistaken. But it's definitely a longer setup now, and you can really feel that while riding. What we don't have, though, are any kind of overdrive gears. The 5th gear isn't any taller than the first 4. So in terms of gear ratios, everything stayed exactly the same. And just so you're fully up to speed, I forgot to mention a couple of things about the US spec version. It's not just the catalytic converter that's different. In Europe, we also get less bulky indicators. And something a lot of people have already pointed out at trade shows or in photos is this thing at the back. It kind of looks like a little toolbox mounted on the tail. But in reality, that's the carbon canister. Pretty much all bikes have one, but on the Suzuki, it's ended up being mounted here at the rear, opposite the exhaust silencer. Its job is to collect excess carbon vapor from the tank, and it's actually required by law. Right now, that's all cleared up. I think we can finally get to the riding impressions. And I'll start with some relaxed off-road riding. On the whole, it's a pretty capable machine, especially in terms of suspension travel and how much give you've got to work with. But I'd say it's not really made for hitting hardcore single-track trails. Most people who go for that probably already own a proper hard enduro. On a trip or adventure ride, it'll be mostly gravel roads you'll be tackling. As for the ergonomics, I'll just hop on the seat here. I think they've done a good job. The seat height, which I already mentioned, is 920 millimeters. At 1.85 m, it fits me really well. Even slightly shorter riders should still get on fine. Hard to judge exactly where the limit is, but the bike is super narrow, which helps. One thing that really impressed me on gravel was how well it handles while seated. The bars are set upright and there's loads of room to shift forward and back. The suspension in this stock setup feels really nicely balanced, not too firm. The fork is on the softer side but still stable, while the rear is a bit stiffer. That gives you good feel, especially when you're riding on looser gravel or forest roads. These are the kind of forestry tracks where the surface can get a bit rough and chunky at times. So it's nice to have a bit of travel left to soak things up instead of getting a jolt straight away. But when you hit a bump, there's still enough support at the rear to keep things planted. Next big positive, the brakes. I think they've nailed it here. With the larger discs, you get more stopping power. I'll get to how it performs on tarmac later, but in terms of tuning, the brake feel is nice and soft initially, with progressive build-up in stopping force. Even the rear brake is easy to modulate. As mentioned, the ABS can be fully turned off at the rear, and that's exactly how I rode it. The ABS itself works pretty smoothly. It's quick, doesn't intervene in a jarring way, but I reckon most people will turn it off fairly quickly once on loose ground. That combination, good ergonomics, plenty of room to move, really helps you ride confidently. You can almost ride it motocross style through gravel corners. At the same time, the throttle response isn't overly aggressive. The suspension breaks away gently, and both front and rear brakes are soft but powerful enough and easy to control. That makes it easy to get a feel for grip, even when the weather's unpredictable or the surface is a bit slick. So even if you're not a full-on off-road hero, you can really find your limits safely. Now for the engine. The gearing is quite long, and in more technical off-road bits that really plays a role. I was mostly using first gear at the speeds I'm comfortable riding, but even on those easier gravel or forest tracks, which is more the kind of riding most of us will be doing, The engine's got plenty of punch, really responsive down low. And it's actually the first Suzuki where I don't find the A mode too aggressive. On their road bikes or even on the bigger adventure bikes, I usually find the A mode a bit too twitchy, especially that artificial on-off response when you first open the throttle. That's not my thing, I usually ride in B mode. But here they've nailed it. The A mode isn't jerky at all. The first few millimeters of throttle travel are really smooth, and then the power builds up really nicely. More than enough, especially with the tires we've got fitted. Speaking of which, the tires are from a brand I'm not too familiar with, and to be honest, I'd probably fit something more recognizable if I were planning proper gravel touring, just so the bike's performance isn't held back. Maybe something like a TKC 80 or even a slightly more off-road focused option. The tires here have a very round profile, and up front I felt like there was a bit of a lack in lateral grip on gravel, but that's nitpicking really. On the whole, it's very intuitive to ride standing up. You can easily move your outer knee forward, the foot pegs feel spot on, and all the levers were right where I wanted them in stock trim. So I felt at home on the bike pretty quickly. And when you do open the throttle and let it rip, the vibrations, especially for a single cylinder, really aren't bad at all. But that was already true of the old DR-Z400. It was known for being a pretty smooth, user-friendly thumper. And that hasn't changed one bit here. When you open the throttle, you actually get a fairly wide power band to work with. It's not like the power just fizzles out at the top. It's definitely not a limp engine. Of course, the low weight also plays a big role. Even on gravel, there's a real sense of playfulness, and you start to throw it around a bit more freely. On the sides of gravel tracks, if there's a chance to catch a bump or an uneven bit of terrain, you just go for it. The more skilled riders among the other journalists were pulling massive wheelies and just messing about. It really had that light-hearted, playful feel. And the engine encourages that kind of riding. The center of gravity feels quite low, and overall the bike is really agile. Even though it's around 10 kilos heavier than its predecessor, some of the people who actually own the older DR-Z400 said you don't really notice it. I'll take their word for it, because fully fueled at 151 kilos, it still feels properly light. Another great point, the gearbox shifts smoothly even without using the clutch. Speaking of the clutch, this might actually be one of the biggest wins on the DR-Z4S. It's not a hydraulic unit like on some hard enduros, it's cable operated. But wow, it's unbelievably light to use. Apparently it's 25% lighter than on the previous model. I can't confirm that myself since I never rode the old one. But it's buttery smooth and you can operate it with just one finger. The biting point is precise, and when you're in tougher terrain, that's incredibly useful. A quick word on the electronics as well, because this is one area where Suzuki has gone in a different direction compared to a lot of other manufacturers. We've got a gravel mode, but unlike say Honda's version, which is ultra safe and restrictive, this one gives you loads of room to play, especially in combination with the punchy engine, the light chassis, and these tires which don't have massive grip. The rear can step out a bit quicker, so I really appreciated being able to activate that gravel traction control mode when I just wanted to enjoy the stunning scenery here in Oregon. It gives you enough freedom that you can tackle a loose hill climb or even head off onto a single trail without worrying. You can ride in with confidence and still keep it dynamic and lively over the rough sections. You're not going to get stuck just because the surface is loose. Hats off to Suzuki for the way they've tuned this mode. It gives you safety and confidence without killing all the fun. The rear doesn't just snap out suddenly, but you're still allowed to have a bit of off-road playfulness. But things got really interesting when we left the nice wide forestry roads and headed into what I found to be fairly technical terrain, because the US, for anyone who doesn't know, is an absolute playground for off-road fans. So we've already tackled a few trails today, and tomorrow we're looking at 40 miles of almost nothing but single track. So the next time you see me, it'll probably be a pretty exhausted but hopefully very happy Gregor. And he'll be telling you all about the more demanding off-road riding. Now I'm checking in from the second riding day after some serious off-road action. And what trails! I've cooled down a bit now standing here in the queue in front of the camera, but earlier it really got intense. Unreal the kind of trails you're allowed to ride here legally. We had a bit of gravel road again, but today was all about single track, beautiful flowing sections, some of them wider where you could really surf your way through the banked corners, but also some seriously tight ones with lots of rocks and thanks to the changing weather, super slippery in parts. So it was a wide-ranging and exciting day and a great chance to explore the limits, or at least my own personal limits, on the DR-Z400 or 4S. And in these situations, my number one lifesaver, or let's say life simplifier, was the engine. It just keeps revving and delivering, especially now considering I'm really just a hobby level trail tourist and honestly not very used to riding single track. Back in Austria, you're already lucky if you can find a legal gravel road. I'm usually on my Tenere or some other big adventure bike, so a super light dual sport like this on proper single track, that was something quite special for me. And yeah, I struggled at times. I'd mess up my line, lose my balance, and often found myself in a spot where, because I didn't react quickly enough or didn't have a finger on the clutch, I couldn't disengage it in time. On most bikes, the engine would just stall. But this one, it just keeps chugging. A proper tractor-like engine. Super forgiving, just keeps pushing forward and pulls you out of those sketchy situations before they become real problems. I found it performs best in ambitious off-road riding at low and mid revs. Given my pace and skill level, I mostly stayed in first gear. The quicker riders told me they were in second gear since they were able to keep more momentum. Especially in slippery conditions, that let them work with the lower rev range, manage torque more effectively, and they used the clutch, which, as I mentioned, is incredibly easy to control and feather light. That was life simplifier number 2 today. And life simplifier number 3, that would be the already mentioned gravel mode. Because these trails really pushed me and naturally I got tired. It was a long day. We rode 40 miles and I'd say 80% of that was on single track. That's quite a lot of riding time, and the more tired you get, the more your technique starts to slip. So I was honestly super thankful for that gravel mode. I've got some footage. It's incredible what that mode can do. Today we had this one really loose little hill climb and I was already feeling pretty spent. I just held the throttle open and let the bike carry me up, and it actually manages to allow just enough slippage in loose gravel to keep you moving forward without making you worry. Because with these tires, and let's be honest, without traction control, you'd be spinning out in no time. As I got more fatigued, I switched back into B mode for the throttle response just to make it a bit more forgiving. Since I mentioned the pros earlier, yeah, there were some seriously skilled riders in this group. I've got a few clips of them just playing around, hopping over stuff with the DR-Z, and that says a lot. This bike clearly isn't just made for hobby riders. One more thing I wanted to say about the suspension. It actually has a pretty wide adjustment range. For example, on the fork, there are 23 clicks of adjustment. I didn't change the stock settings because I prefer a softer front end again to make things a bit more forgiving and to avoid feeling every single bump. The standard setup is set at 10 clicks out of a possible 23, going from soft to hard. The faster riders told me they added around 4 clicks to both compression and rebound damping just to keep the fork from diving so much on steep descents, so they could brake harder and get more front end stability. They also tweaked the rear rebound since we encountered quite a few whoops and repeated bumps, and they wanted to avoid the rear end kicking too much. So if you think about it, 4 more clicks on the fork gets you to 14 clicks, leaving another 9 clicks until full firmness. I'd say the range is seriously impressive. Were there any limits that I personally noticed? The gearbox is one topic worth discussing. It's geared quite tall. That meant I stayed in first gear, which luckily is nice and tame. But I'd say the gearing starts to show its limits when you're doing really technical off-road riding. We had a section with steep, loose terrain and a bit of a queue building up in this rut. And in that moment, I would have loved a shorter gear ratio. Same thing if you're riding something like 5 kilometers in an hour through highly technical terrain. That's not really what this bike is made for. And in those situations, yeah, the gearing is a bit too tall. But honestly, today I felt like the tires were the biggest limitation. I think they're called IRS, Trail Winner. I'd never heard of the brand before, to be honest. The tires are 70% road, 30% off-road, and for serious off-road use, I'd definitely go for something 50-50 or even more aggressive. Simply because the rest of the bike performed so well today that I'd want the tires to match that. The tires were the limiting factor, especially when things got slippery like they did today. I felt more like a passenger at times, at least in my case. Another interesting point, tire pressure. Since the bike is so light, you can actually run really low pressures with these tube tires. It's written right on the rear fender. The standard is 1.5 and 1.75 bar, but today we even ran just 1 bar. So yeah, there's a lot of room to play with, and sure, every now and then you'll hit a rock or a root sticking out of the ground, but I checked my rim and didn't find any major dents. The quality is good. The rims come from Excel, a well-known manufacturer in the off-road world. They supply Suzuki and make the stock wheels for the DR-Z. Speaking of durability, of course, when it got rough, I had a fall. Naturally, it's still noticeably heavier than a hard enduro. When it was lying downhill on the ground, I really felt those 150 kilos. But while riding, honestly, you don't feel it much. And even owners of the old DR-Z400 said that on these trails, the bike feels really well balanced, especially with the optimized center of gravity. For example, the battery is mounted fairly low in the rear, partly because there's just no space under the tank anymore. This is a platform that's been around a while, modernized and adapted, but it handles really well and feels agile. And despite quite a few crashes, mine and others, none of the bikes ended up out of commission. So yeah, cautious thumbs up for durability. Right, time to talk a bit about how it performs on the road. Let's get back to the other side of dual sport riding. You've heard all about the off-road part. Now let's talk about tarmac, because that's also part of what a dual sport bike is meant for. To be honest, this engine gives me a lot of hope for the upcoming supermoto version. Here in the US, the roads are wide, really wide, and built to a high standard. So it was mostly long straights, a few bends and then straight again. But we did get a few twisties too, not super tight by European standards, but enough to get a bit of a feel for it. First impression, up to around 100 kilometers per hour, the engine offers a decent amount of power. There's always enough torque for a quick burst of acceleration. Of course, you do feel that big front wheel when you tip it into corners, which is why I'm really looking forward to the supermoto version. With 17-inch wheels, it's going to be much quicker through turns, I reckon. What's also great is the amount of freedom to move around. You can really lean into it, but also steer it in fairly neutrally, because the suspension hits a sweet spot. It rolls over bumps comfortably, but doesn't keep bouncing thanks to its progressive damping. Even on patchy, uneven asphalt, you could still get on the throttle confidently. The brakes, again, maybe a touch soft for pure road use, but still well balanced overall. I think this bike really nails what a dual sport is meant to do, and that is finding the right balance between on-road and off-road riding. On top of that, fuel consumption isn't too bad either. Suzuki claims 3.5 liters per 100 kilometers. And even riding at a brisk pace today, with a relatively small tank, we covered more than 120 kilometers and still had 2 bars left out of 6. That's actually pretty decent range. And now, shifting from cornering to long distance riding, payload is another highlight. Suzuki claims a maximum permissible weight of 340 kilograms. With a 150 kilo bike and me at 75 kilos, or maybe a bit more, that still leaves plenty of room for luggage. And unlike the old model, or at least some of the older ones, this one's even approved for a Pillion. Though space becomes more of an issue than weight, to be fair, you definitely have to be quite cozy with each other to ride 2 up on this thing. Speaking of long distance, it is still a single-cylinder dual sport, so compromises are part of the package. But when it comes to service intervals, it's actually pretty solid. Valve clearance checks are due at around 24,000 kilometers, if I've converted that from miles correctly. So yeah, that's quite respectable. The oil change interval is around 5,000 kilometers. For a single cylinder, I think that's absolutely fine. You get a range of about 250 kilometers. As for the seat, from what I've heard, it's a big improvement over the stock seat from the old model. Just judging this one on its own, I wouldn't say it's overly plush, but it's definitely not too thin either, which means you don't sink through it too quickly. Sure, it has a certain firmness, and after a long stretch in the saddle, it might start to feel a bit hard. But honestly, I prefer that. Better to have a firm seat you get used to than one that's too soft and bottoms out right away, leaving you constantly shifting around to get comfy. So yeah, well done there too. Now let's circle back to what's probably the most criticized point. The gearbox. Like I said before, still 5 gears, same gear ratios, long final drive. In practice, that means you can easily cruise up to 100 kilometers per hour and you don't get any unpleasant vibrations, though they do become a bit more high frequency. But even beyond that, there's still enough torque to push on a bit, up to around 120 or 125 kilometers per hour. After that though, the vibrations and the general engine feel start to reach a point where you don't really want to sit there for long periods. You don't want to thrash the engine either. So I'd say, for this bike, stick to a cruising speed around 100 and avoid the motorway where possible. All in all, I had a good time on the road. Right, you've now heard the full riding impressions, so let's bring it all back around to the opening question. And that's my verdict. Is it really worth shelling out 10,000 or just under 10,000 euros for this bike? First off, I was shocked too. I even posted a poll on Instagram asking what people wanted to know about the DR-Z4S. And I think out of 40 questions, 38 were asking why it's so expensive and whether the price is justified. And honestly, after these 2 riding days, it's not an easy question to answer. For starters, I looked up the price of the old DR-Z400 when it was already being sold in euros. It was 6,345 euros. And if you run that through an inflation calculator, especially considering the high inflation over the past 3 to 5 years, you get 9,700 euros, which is exactly what the new DR-Z4S costs in Germany. So that's already one argument in favor of the price being justified. But if you compare it to the competition, there's still a big price gap. The Honda CRF 300L costs 6,100 euros, but it only puts out 27 horsepower and it's a much softer bike with less premium components. The KTM 390 Enduro R is 3,400 euros cheaper, but then again, who knows what's going on with the KTM group these days. And even without riding it, I'd say cautiously that Suzuki is offering the higher spec components here. So again, hard to say. And for me, it's a very personal question. I'm thinking of selling my KLR 650 and getting something lighter to go alongside the T7 for more ambitious off-road trips. So I'm also asking myself the same question, is it really worth dropping nearly 10,000 euros on this thing? And honestly, the only real criticism I have, because it performed so well off-road, on-road in light and heavy terrain, is the gearbox. This is a really well done modern take on the DR-Z400, a bike that's already been well loved in the enduro scene. They didn't throw the concept out, they've carefully updated and improved it. So yeah, it's a great machine. But my only real complaint is that I wish it either had a 5th gear as an overdrive or a 6th gear altogether. Especially in Germany, not being able to hold higher cruising speeds comfortably is a real downside. And for me, that's the only real fly in the ointment. And it's also the one thing that's making me hesitate, whether it's really worth the money. If it had a 6-speed gearbox, I'd probably say yes, absolutely. But since it doesn't, I'll really have to think it over carefully. To be honest, I just can't give you a straight answer right now, but maybe this video has helped you make up your own mind. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a discussion about it. Overall, it's a seriously exciting bike, really well executed. I'm genuinely impressed with the whole package. It's not too sporty, not too soft, really right where a cool dual sport bike should be. So with that, I hope this video gave you what you were looking for. I believe there'll be a European launch at the end of summer where the Supermoto models will also be revealed. So for those of you waiting for the Supermoto, stay tuned, maybe hit subscribe, and thanks for watching.